The ranch had always been quiet, the kind of quiet that settled into your bones and stayed there. It sat far away from the city, surrounded by open land, dusty roads, and old trees that had seen decades pass without much change. For Daniel, that quiet was not loneliness. It was peace. He had worked his whole life to earn it. Daniel woke up early every morning, long before the sun fully rose. He liked to sit on the porch with a cup of black coffee, watching the sky slowly change color. The land felt alive at that hour. Birds moved through the air, cattle shifted in the distance, and the wind carried the smell of dry grass. This ranch was not just property to him. It was his home, his shelter. And his reward for years of hard work, he had bought the land legally years before the nearby housing community even existed. Back then, it was just empty space and dirt roads. Over time, developers arrived, building neat rows of houses and forming a homeowners association to manage their neighborhood. Daniel paid no attention to it. His ranch was separate, clearly marked, and not part of their community. At least that's what the paperwork said. Problems started slowly. First came letters in the mail, notices about property appearance and community standards. Daniel read them once and tossed them aside. They meant nothing to him. He was not a member of that association, never had been, and never agreed to their rules. He assumed that would be the end of it, but it wasn't. The letters became more aggressive. Fines were mentioned, then warnings. Daniel stayed calm. He kept copies of his land records in a locked drawer and trusted that the law was clear. Still, something about the tone of the messages bothered him. They were written to scare, not to inform. That morning started like any other. Daniel finished feeding the animals and was checking a fence line when he heard engines coming up the dirt road. That alone was unusual. Most people didn't drive out this far unless they had a reason. He turned and saw two vehicles approaching, both dark-colored SUVs. They kicked up dust as they rolled closer, stopping just short of his gate. Daniel stood still, watching. 4 men stepped out. They wore dark uniforms that looked official at first glance. There were patches on their shoulders, badges on their chests, and belts filled with gear. One of the vehicles had lettering on the side that read HOA enforcement. That was the first red flag. HOAs didn't have enforcement officers. Not like this. One of the men walked forward, adjusting his belt as if he had done this many times before. His posture was confident, almost rehearsed. He stopped a few feet away and spoke loudly, like he wanted control of the situation from the first word. "Sir, we're here for a compliance inspection," he said. Daniel didn't respond right away. He looked them over carefully. The uniforms were close to law enforcement style, but something felt off. The badges didn't shine the way real ones did. The patches looked newly sewn, and none of the vehicles had government plates. "Compliance with what?" Daniel asked calmly. The man frowned slightly, clearly not expecting to be questioned. "Your property has multiple violations. Unapproved land use, unsafe structures. We have authority to inspect and document immediately." Daniel crossed his arms. "You don't have authority here." The second man stepped forward, voice sharper. "Sir, don't make this difficult. Refusal can lead to fines or removal." That word stuck out, removal. Daniel felt a slow, steady anger rise in his chest, but he kept his voice even. "You're on private land. You're not law enforcement. If you want to be here, you need to leave." The first man smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "We are enforcement. HOA enforcement. Same difference." Daniel almost laughed at that. Almost. He had dealt with pressure before in his life. He knew intimidation when he saw it. These men were counting on fear, on confusion. They wanted him to believe they had power. "I'm asking you once," Daniel said. "Leave my property." Instead of leaving, one of the men pulled out a phone and started taking pictures. Another moved closer to the gate, testing it with his hand. That crossed a line. "Step back," Daniel warned. The men ignored him. One started listing violations out loud, reading from a clipboard filled with printed forms. The language sounded official, but the details were vague. No case numbers. No clear references, just threats wrapped in words. Daniel felt the situation shifting. This was no longer just harassment. This was an attempt to force entry. He reached into his pocket and quietly started recording on his phone. "You're impersonating authority," Daniel said. "That's a crime." The first man's smile vanished. "Careful with your words." Daniel met his eyes. "I am." The wind blew dust across the road. For a moment, everything felt tense and still, like the air before a storm. Daniel realized something important then. These men didn't expect resistance. They expected submission, and they had chosen the wrong ranch, as the men continued talking over him, threatening inspections and consequences. Daniel thought about one thing only. He was not alone, and he was not powerless. He just had to stay calm, stay smart, and let them reveal exactly who they were. This was only the beginning. The men did not leave. After the first tense exchange, they stayed right where they were, as if waiting for Daniel to change his mind. One leaned against the SUV, arms crossed. Another kept writing on the clipboard, making loud marks with his pen, clearly meant to be heard. They wanted him to feel watched, judged, surrounded. Daniel stayed near the gate. He did not step closer, and he did not step back. His heart was beating faster now, but his face stayed calm. Years of dealing with pressure had taught him one simple rule: never let fear speak for you. The man with the clipboard cleared his throat. "This inspection will happen today," he said. "If you refuse, the penalties increase." Daniel looked at the papers from a distance. "Those papers don't mean anything here," the man scoffed. "You don't get to decide that." Daniel nodded slowly. "Actually, I do. This land isn't part of your association. You know that?" There was a flicker of something in the man's eyes. Not anger. Not confidence. It was hesitation. The first man, the one who seemed to be in charge, stepped forward again. His voice dropped, quieter now, but sharper. "Sir, we're trying to help you avoid bigger trouble. Things can get complicated if you don't cooperate." Daniel heard the threat clearly this time. It wasn't hidden anymore. "I'm cooperating by telling you to leave," Daniel said. "That's the only cooperation you're getting." The second man laughed, but it sounded forced. "You ranch people always think the rules don't apply to you." Daniel's jaw tightened. "The law applies to everyone, including you." That seemed to irritate them more than shouting ever would have. One of the men took a step toward the gate again, reaching for the latch. "Don't," Daniel said. The man stopped, but only barely. "Or what?" Daniel held up his phone, still recording. "Or this becomes evidence." The word evidence changed the air. The man pulled his hand back, pretending it was no big deal. "You think a phone scares us?" Daniel shrugged. "It doesn't have to scare you. It just has to tell the truth." For a moment, no one spoke. The wind moved through the grass behind Daniel, and a cow lowed somewhere in the distance. The quiet felt heavy. Then the leader spoke again. "We're issuing a notice of non-compliance," he said. "You'll hear from us soon." He motioned to the others, and slowly, reluctantly, they turned back to their vehicles. As the SUVs rolled away, Daniel stayed where he was until the dust settled. Only then did he let out a long breath. He knew this wasn't over. That afternoon, Daniel sat at his kitchen table, papers spread out in front of him. Deeds, surveys, old letters. Everything that proved the ranch was his and his alone. He checked dates, signatures, boundaries. It was all solid. Still, something bothered him. The way those men had acted, the confidence they showed at first, then the cracks. They weren't just overzealous volunteers. They were playing a role. Over the next few days, things escalated. More letters arrived, hand-delivered this time. Notices taped to the gate. Threats of forced entry. Each one used stronger language than the last. Daniel photographed everything and kept copies. He also noticed something strange. None of the notices were signed by real officials. Just titles. No names. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Daniel noticed headlights again on the dirt road. This time, only one vehicle. It stopped closer than before. 2 men got out. They were dressed the same way as before. But now they carried themselves differently. Less loud, more tense. "We need to talk," one said. Daniel stayed behind the gate. "You can talk from there," the man sighed. "Look, this doesn't have to go bad. Just let us do the inspection, and we'll be out of your hair." "And if I don't?" Daniel asked. The man hesitated. "Then things get messy." Daniel leaned forward slightly. "Messy for who?" The man didn't answer. That was when Daniel knew for sure. These men were bluffing. They were counting on him giving in before anyone with real authority got involved. He went inside and made a call. Not to the police. Not yet. The person on the other end listened quietly as Daniel explained everything. The fake uniforms. The threats. The notices. When Daniel finished, there was a pause. "Put your phone on speaker next time they show up," the voice said calmly. "And don't let them rush you." Daniel felt a strange sense of relief. Someone understood. The next morning, the SUVs returned. Same road, same dust. Same show, but this time Daniel was ready. As the men stepped out and started their routine, Daniel calmly placed his phone on the fence post and tapped the screen. "You're being recorded," he said. "Every word." The leader frowned. "You can't do that." Daniel smiled slightly. "I can." The man opened his mouth to argue, but before he could speak, a new voice came through the phone. Steady, clear, controlled. "Good morning," the voice said. "I have a few questions." The men froze. "Who are you?" one demanded. "Someone who knows the law," the voice replied. "And someone who knows you don't belong here." Daniel watched as the confidence drained from their faces. "Just a little," the voice continued, asking simple questions. Jurisdiction, authority, legal basis. Each question was calm, direct, and impossible to dodge. The men stumbled over their answers. "That's what I thought," the voice said. "You're impersonating authority on private land. That's serious." One of the men tried to interrupt, but the voice cut him off. "You should leave. Now." For the first time since this started, the men looked unsure of themselves. They backed away slowly, muttering under their breath. Before getting into their vehicles and driving off faster than before, Daniel stood there, phone still recording, heart pounding. He knew one thing for sure now. They had just made a very big mistake. The ranch felt different after that day. Not quieter, not louder, just heavier. Daniel could feel it in the way the air sat still in the afternoons, and how the nights felt longer than usual. He kept going with his routine because routine was grounding. Animals still needed feeding. Fences still needed checking. Life didn't stop just because trouble was circling, but Daniel knew they were not done. The next few days passed without anyone showing up. And that silence felt intentional. Like someone stepping back only to charge harder. Daniel stayed alert. He kept his phone charged at all times. He parked his truck facing the road instead of the barn so he could leave quickly if needed. Then, early one morning, before the sun was fully up, he heard engines again. This time there were more. 3 vehicles came down the dirt road. Not rushing, not slow, controlled, confident. They stopped closer than before. Right in front of the gate, doors opened almost at the same time. 6 men stepped out. They were dressed the same as before. But now they looked more prepared. Harder faces. Tighter movements. One of them carried a folder thick with papers. Another wore a small body camera clipped to his chest. Daniel stood on his side of the gate. Phone already recording. The man with the folder spoke first. "Final notice," he said. "You have refused compliance multiple times. We are authorized to enter." Daniel shook his head slowly. "You're lying." The man lifted the folder. "Court-backed authority." Daniel didn't step forward. "Show me the order." "Not a copy. Not a form. A real one." The man hesitated for half a second. It was quick, but Daniel caught it. "This inspection is happening," the man said, louder now. "Step aside." "No," Daniel replied. The tension snapped instantly. One of the men moved toward the gate again. Another reached for the latch. "Stop," Daniel said. The man laughed. "Or what?" Daniel didn't answer. He simply tapped his phone screen and placed it on speaker. A calm voice filled the space between them. "Gentlemen," the voice said. "You've been warned already." Every man froze. "Who is this?" the leader demanded. "Someone who has reviewed everything you've done so far," the voice replied. "And someone who has already alerted the right people." The men exchanged glances. The voice continued, slow and steady. "You are not law enforcement. You have no jurisdiction here. You are trespassing and attempting to intimidate a private landowner." One of the men scoffed. "You don't know who you're talking to." There was a pause. "I know exactly who I'm talking to," the voice said. "And I know what impersonating authority carries as a penalty." Daniel watched the shift happen. It wasn't dramatic. No shouting. No sudden movement. Just a subtle change in posture. Shoulders tightening. Hands flexing. The leader tried again. "We're just doing our job." "You don't have one?" the voice replied. "Not like this." The body camera suddenly didn't look so confident anymore. The voice gave them one clear instruction. "Leave, now, and do not return." For a moment, it looked like one of the men might argue. Then another shook his head slightly. That was enough. They backed away from the gate, slowly, one by one. The engine started. Dust rose again. But Daniel knew this still wasn't over. Later that afternoon, Daniel drove into town for supplies. At the feed store, conversations felt different. People looked at him longer than usual. One man finally spoke up. "You okay out there?" he asked quietly. Daniel nodded. "Why?" The man lowered his voice. "Heard some folks talking. HOA has been saying things." "What kind of things?" Daniel asked. "That you're dangerous? That you won't cooperate? That they need to step in before something bad happens?" Daniel felt anger rise, but he kept it inside. This was another tactic. Control the story. Over the next few days, rumors spread. Anonymous complaints. Strange drive-bys at night. One evening, Daniel found his gate partially open when he knew he had locked it. He didn't panic. He documented everything. Then came the letter. Not from the HOA. From a legal office. It was carefully worded, polite, professional. Claimed Daniel was obstructing lawful inspections and creating a hostile environment. Daniel read it twice. Then he made another call. "This just turned serious," he said. "Yes." The calm voice replied. "And now it ends." The next morning, Daniel didn't wait. When the vehicles arrived again, he didn't argue. He didn't threaten. He simply stood still as real county deputies pulled in behind the SUVs. Everything changed in seconds. Real badges. Real authority. The fake confidence vanished. Voices rose. Papers were demanded. Stories fell apart. Daniel watched quietly as the men were separated, questioned and searched. One of them tried to explain. Another tried to blame the HOA board. It didn't matter. The truth was finally in the open as the deputies finished their work. One of them turned to Daniel. "You did the right thing," he said. Daniel nodded. Exhaustion finally setting in. The ranch was quiet again. But this time, the quiet felt earned after the deputies left that day. The ranch did not return to normal right away. The dust settled, the road went quiet, but something had changed. Word travels fast in small places, and this story moved even faster. People talked at gas stations, feed stores, and coffee counters. Some whispered, some exaggerated. But everyone knew one thing for sure now. Those men had crossed a line. Daniel felt the weight of it all more in the evenings than during the day. At night, when the work was done and the land was quiet, his mind replayed everything. The way the fake officers had stood, the confidence they carried, the way it disappeared the moment real authority showed up. It reminded him how thin the line was between order and chaos when people pretended to have power they didn't. A few days later, an official letter arrived from the county. This one was real. It confirmed what Daniel already knew, but needed in writing. His ranch was fully outside the HOA's control. Always had been. Any attempt to enforce rules on his land was unlawful. Daniel read the letter slowly. then folded it and placed it with his other documents. It felt like relief, but it also felt like validation. He hadn't imagined any of it. He hadn't overreacted. He had simply stood his ground. But the pressure did not stop completely. The HOA board went quiet publicly, but privately they were scrambling. Daniel learned this through small signs. A truck from a law office parked near the housing development for hours at a time. Board members stopped waving when they passed his road. A few neighbors he barely knew suddenly wanted to talk. One afternoon, a man from the nearby community showed up alone. No uniform, no clipboard, just regular clothes and nervous body language. "I'm not here to cause trouble," the man said quickly. "Just wanted to clear the air." Daniel listened, but said nothing. "The board didn't mean for things to go that far," the man continued. "They trusted the wrong people. They sent fake authority onto my land." The man nodded. "I know, and people are upset. Lawsuits upset." Daniel didn't smile. They should be. The man left not long after, clearly realizing there was nothing to fix with words anymore. Over the next week, official investigations began. Daniel was contacted for statements. He handed over recordings, photos, letters, and timelines. Everything was clean, organized, and clear. He had nothing to hide. The truth painted an ugly picture. The HOA had hired a private group to scare property owners into compliance. They used uniforms designed to confuse, language meant to intimidate. They relied on fear and silence. Daniel felt a strange mix of anger and sadness. Not for himself, but for others who might have been pushed around the same way and never pushed back. One evening, Daniel received a call from the same calm voice that had guided him through the worst moments. "You handled it exactly right," the voice said. "Most people would have panicked." Daniel exhaled. "I thought about it. That's normal," the voice replied. "Courage isn't loud. It's steady." That night, Daniel sat on his porch longer than usual. The stars were bright. The land felt like his again, not just legally, but emotionally. No eyes watching. No engines coming down the road. Days turned into weeks. The HOA's authority weakened as details came out. Board members resigned. Fines were refunded. Lawyers got busy. Daniel stayed out of it as much as he could. He focused on his animals, his land, his peace. But he knew this story wasn't finished yet. Consequences take time. One morning, Daniel noticed a sheriff's vehicle parked near the entrance to the housing community. Then another, and another. Something official was happening. Later that day, the news reached him. Charges were being filed. Not rumors. Not threats. Real charges. Impersonation, trespassing, coercion. Daniel sat quietly after hearing it. He didn't celebrate. He didn't feel victorious. He felt resolved. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the trees, Daniel walked his fence line one last time before dark. Everything was in place. Solid. Strong. The ranch was quiet, and for the first time in a long while, the quiet felt permanent. Time did what force could not. It settled things. After the investigations began, life on the ranch slowly returned to its natural rhythm. Mornings came with the same pale light. Evenings cooled the land the same way they always had. Daniel kept working, kept showing up for the land the way he always did. He learned that healing did not come with noise or announcements. It came quietly, one normal day at a time. The legal process moved forward without drama. There were meetings Daniel did not attend and arguments he'd never heard. Lawyers spoke in rooms far away from his ranch. Papers changed hands. Decisions were made. Daniel stayed focused on what he could control. Every now and then, someone would stop by the gate. Not to threaten. Not to inspect. Just to talk. Some were neighbors who wanted to apologize for believing the rumors. Others were people who said they had been scared into paying fines they never owed. Daniel listened more than he spoke. He didn't lecture. He didn't say, "I told you so." He simply told the truth when asked, and let people decide what to do with it. One afternoon, a letter arrived that felt different from all the others. It was short, clear. Final, the HOA, was officially barred from any involvement with his land. Permanently, Daniel read the letter once, then folded it carefully and placed it in the same drawer as the first deed he had ever signed. The drawer was not just storage. It was proof. Proof that patience and clarity mattered. The men who had pretended to be authority faded from the picture. Some faced charges. Others disappeared from the area entirely. The uniforms, the vehicles, the confidence, it all meant nothing once the truth stood in the open. Daniel thought about how close it all had come to going wrong. If he had shouted, if he had rushed, if he had panicked, any one of those could have changed the story. Instead, he had stayed calm. That calm had carried him through. Late one evening, Daniel got a call. The same steady voice he had come to trust. "It's done," the voice said. Daniel sat on the porch watching the sky fade into deep blue. "I figured it would be." "You protected more than your land," the voice continued. "You set a line others didn't know they could draw." Daniel thought about that after the call ended. He had never planned to be an example. He had only planned to protect what was his, but sometimes that was enough. The ranch felt different now. Not because of what had happened, but because of what would never happen again. No more threats in the mailbox. No more engines creeping down the road. No more watching shadows for signs of trouble. Daniel slept better. He laughed more. He trusted the quiet. Again, months passed. Seasons changed. The land carried on like it always had, steady and honest. Daniel repaired fences, helped neighbors when needed, and kept his life simple. He never sought attention. He never told the story unless someone asked. When people did ask, he kept it short. "They tried to scare me," he'd say. It didn't work. One morning, while fixing a gate, Daniel paused and looked out across the land. The sun was low. The wind moved gently through the grass. Everything was exactly as it should be, he realized. Something then. The real victory wasn't stopping the HOA. It wasn't exposing fake authority. It wasn't even winning legally. The real victory was keeping his peace. Daniel closed the gate, wiped his hands, and walked back toward the house. No cameras. No paperwork. No witnesses. Just a man, his land, and the quiet he had earned, and that was enough. Life did not suddenly become perfect after everything settled. But it became honest again. Daniel noticed that difference right away. There were no surprises waiting at the gate anymore. No papers taped to fences. No unfamiliar vehicles slowing down near his road. What remained was real life, with its small problems and quiet rewards. Part of Daniel expected to feel proud of himself, but pride never really showed up. What he felt instead was calm. A calm that came from knowing he had faced something unfair and didn't let it change who he was. He still woke up early, still drank his coffee on the porch, still worked until his hands were sore. Nothing about his routine changed, and that mattered to him. People, however, did change. More neighbors began stopping by, sometimes just to talk, sometimes to ask questions. Many of them had stories of their own. Not as extreme as Daniel's, but similar enough to feel familiar. Finds that made no sense. Threats that felt wrong. Pressure to agree quickly and ask questions later. Daniel listened. One older man admitted. He had paid hundreds just to avoid trouble. Another said he sold part of his land because he was told he had no choice. A woman said she had cried in her car after a visit from the same group of men who had come to Daniel's ranch. Hearing those stories made something shift inside him. The anger he had worked so hard to keep controlled found a new shape. It wasn't sharp anymore. It was steady. Daniel realized then that what happened to him was never meant to stop with him. It was meant to spread. He didn't turn into a leader or start giving speeches. That wasn't his way. What he did instead was simple. When people asked questions, he answered honestly. When they needed proof, he showed documents. When they needed confidence, he reminded them that fear only works when no one pushes back. Word spread slowly, then faster. The housing community began to change. Meetings that once lasted 10 quiet minutes suddenly stretched into hours. Board members were questioned. Decisions were challenged. People stopped assuming authority meant correctness. Daniel never attended those meetings, but he heard about them. Someone always filled them in later. They keep bringing you up, one neighbor said. Daniel shrugged. I didn't do anything special. Yes, you did, the neighbor replied. You said no? It stayed with Daniel, saying no had been enough. Months later, a local reporter reached out. The story had traveled further than Daniel realized. The reporter wanted an interview, a photo, a statement. Daniel declined. He didn't want attention. He didn't want his face attached to something that belonged to the land more than to him. He believed some victories were quieter when left alone. The reporter respected that and moved on. Winter came and went. Spring followed. The ranch bloomed in small, stubborn ways. Grass pushed through old soil. Calves were born. Repairs were made. One afternoon, while fixing a fence, Daniel noticed a familiar road dust trail in the distance. For a brief moment, his body reacted before his mind did. Muscles tightened. Breath slowed. But when the vehicle came closer, it wasn't trouble. It was someone asking for directions. Daniel gave them, watched them drive off, and felt a quiet relief settle in his chest. That reaction told him something important. The past no longer owned his present. Later that evening, Daniel sat on the porch again, the same place where so much of this had begun. The sky was clear. Stars appeared one by one. The land felt wide and forgiving. He thought about power. Real power wasn't loud uniforms or official-sounding titles. It wasn't threats or pressure. Real power was knowing where you stood and refusing to move. When you were right, Daniel smiled at the thought. He had never set out to prove anything. He only wanted to live in peace. But sometimes, peace had to be defended before it could be enjoyed. As the night deepened, the ranch settled into its familiar quiet. Daniel finished his coffee, stood up, and went inside. Tomorrow would be another normal day. What surprised him most was how deeply the whole experience had settled inside him. On the surface, life looked the same. Same porch, same land, same sky. But inside, Daniel had changed. He was more aware now, not in a fearful way, but in a grounded one. He paid attention to details, words, silences, intent. Some mornings, he would pause mid-task and simply look around. The fence lines stretching into the distance. The animals moving calmly. The land holding everything together. He realized how close he had come to losing not the ranch itself, but the sense of safety tied to it. Safety, he learned, was fragile when people pretended to own authority. As weeks passed, Daniel began receiving small signs that the story was still traveling. A letter from someone he didn't know, thanking him for standing firm. A message passed along through a neighbor saying another community had stopped a similar situation early because people asked questions sooner. Daniel never replied to most of these messages. Not because he didn't care, but because he didn't know what to say. He wasn't trying to inspire anyone. He had just refused to be pushed. One afternoon, while repairing an old shed door, Daniel noticed a vehicle parked on the road for longer than usual. He didn't panic. He wiped his hands and walked calmly toward the gate. The person inside rolled down the window, middle-aged, nervous smile. I just wanted to say thank you, the person said. Daniel nodded. For what? For showing it's okay to ask for proof. The vehicle drove away after that. No long conversation. No explanation. Just a simple moment that stayed with Daniel longer than he expected. He thought about how often people accepted pressure simply because it came wrapped in official language, forms, uniforms, confident voices. Most people were not weak. They were just tired. Daniel understood that now. Late one evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Daniel sat on the porch and reflected on how easily things could have gone differently. If he had raised his voice, if he had rushed to call authorities without documenting anything, if he had acted from fear instead of clarity, none of those paths ended well. The one that worked required patience. As months went by, Daniel noticed another change. He began trusting himself more. Not just about land or law, but about judgment. He learned that calm thinking under pressure was a skill. One built slowly over time, that skill followed him into everyday life. When disagreements came up, he listened more. When something felt off, he paused instead of reacting. When people tried to rush him, he slowed the conversation down. One day, while in town, Daniel overheard a heated argument between two people at a counter. One was clearly trying to intimidate the other using fast words and official-sounding terms. Daniel didn't step in. He didn't need to. The other person asked a single question. "Can you show me where that's written?" The tone shifted instantly. Daniel smiled quietly and walked out. Back at the ranch, life continued its honest rhythm. Fences needed replacing. Equipment needed fixing. Weather came and went. There was comfort in problems that could be solved with tools instead of paperwork. Sometimes, Daniel would walk the boundary lines just to remind himself where everything stood. The markers were clear, solid, undeniable. Those markers weren't just physical anymore. They were personal, he had learned, where his limits were, what he would accept, what he would not. One night, Daniel dreamed of the first day the fake enforcement vehicles arrived. But this time, the dream ended differently. The vehicles stopped, turned around, and left without a word. He woke up feeling lighter. It was the first time his mind had let the memory rest in the following weeks. A few more people came quietly for advice. Daniel never gave legal instruction. He never told anyone what to do. He only shared what he had learned. Stay calm. Ask questions. Document everything. Most of all, don't let urgency force decisions. That advice alone saved people from mistakes. One evening, Daniel received another short message from the calm voice that had supported him early on. It wasn't about danger or strategy, just a simple line. "You did good."
Daniel
read it twice, then set his phone down. For the first time since this whole thing began, he felt complete closure. The ranch no longer felt like a place that needed defending. It felt like a place that had been reclaimed as the year moved forward. Daniel stopped thinking of the experience as something that happened to him. Instead, he saw it as something he passed through, and like all difficult passages, it left him changed but stronger. On a quiet morning, Daniel stood at the gate, watching the road stretch empty into the distance. He didn't scan for trouble anymore. He simply observed. The land was quiet. The quiet stayed, and Daniel finally trusted it. The longer time passed, the more Daniel understood that endings were rarely clean. They didn't arrive with clear lines or final words. They faded in slowly, like light at the end of a long day. What remained afterward was not excitement, but balance. Daniel noticed that balance most when nothing demanded his attention. No letters, no visitors, no tension sitting in his chest. Just the sound of wind across open land and the steady movement of animals going about their day. It was in those moments that he realized how much energy fear had once taken from him. Now, that fear was gone, but awareness stayed. One morning, while repairing a section of fence near the edge of the property, Daniel found an old wooden marker half buried in the dirt. It had been there for years, probably placed by someone long before him. He cleaned it off and stood it upright again. The act felt symbolic, even though he hadn't planned it that way. Some boundaries needed reminding. As the seasons shifted, Daniel's routine remained steady. He worked, rested, and lived quietly. Still, people continued to reach out, not as often as before, but enough to remind him that the story hadn't fully settled for everyone else. One afternoon, a couple arrived at the gate. They looked tired. Not physically, but in the way people do when they've been carrying stress for too long. They explained that they owned land, just outside a different community. A familiar pattern had started. Notices, deadlines. Pressured Daniel listened without interrupting. When they finished, he asked a single question. "Have they shown you anything official?" They shook their heads. Daniel nodded. Then, slow everything down. People who are right don't rush. The couple left calmer than they arrived. Moments like that reminded Daniel of something important. Standing up once had created a ripple. He didn't control where it went, but he could choose not to stop it, despite that. Daniel never saw himself as a protector or guide. He was simply someone who had learned the cost of staying silent. He shared that lesson when it mattered and stayed quiet when it didn't. At night, when the ranch settled into darkness, Daniel sometimes reflected on how close he had come to letting intimidation reshape his life. He imagined what might have happened if he had given in. If he had agreed just to avoid trouble, the thought never lasted long. He was grateful he had chosen differently. Weeks later, a letter arrived from a state office. It wasn't about enforcement or conflict. It was a notice confirming new regulations meant to prevent private groups from imitating authority. Someone, somewhere, had learned from what happened. Daniel read the letter slowly, then folded it and set it aside. He didn't feel proud. He felt steady. Change rarely came from anger. It came from clarity. Life on the ranch continued. Repairs were made. Weather-tested structures. Small problems came and went. They were honest problems, the kind that could be solved with time and effort. One morning, Daniel noticed something else had changed. He no longer scanned every vehicle that passed the road. He no longer replayed conversations in his head. His body had let go. That release felt like the real end of the conflict. Later that day, Daniel sat on the porch with a notebook. He wasn't writing a story or preparing anything official. He simply wrote down thoughts, observations, lessons, learned not for the world, for himself. He wrote about staying calm, about listening carefully, about not confusing confidence with truth. When he finished, he closed the notebook and put it away. He didn't plan to look at it again. The ranch grew quiet as evening approached. The sky shifted colors slowly. Daniel stayed seated, letting the day fade naturally. He understood now that some chapters didn't end with victory or defeat. They ended with understanding, and understanding he had learned was enough.